In the sweltering autumn of 1853, an incident occurred at Blackwood Manor so unsettling that the local authorities struck the details from the official county ledger. The legend, whispered by the local field hands and feared by the gentry, spoke of a 10-year-old girl named Cora who vanished into the impenetrable Cypress Reach marsh. The overseer, a man named Elias Thorne, was known for his cruelty and his pack of 10 prize-winning hounds, beasts bred for the hunt and trained to tear. When Cora disappeared, Thorne unleashed all 10, boasting that they would bring her back in pieces. By the time the moon peaked, the search party found a gruesome circle in the mud. 9 of the hounds lay dead, their bodies unmarked by teeth or claw, yet drained of life. Only one dog, a massive beast named Grim, stood sentinel over the empty space where the girl had been. Thorne's mind began to unravel that night, insisting the girl had spoken the life out of his pack without lifting a finger. Before we delve into the dark heart of the marsh, tell me where in the world you are joining us from, and be sure to follow this account so you don't miss the chilling conclusion tomorrow. The sun sat low and heavy, a bruised orange thumbprint against the humid sky. Cora moved through the dust of the animal pens with a grace that belied her exhaustion. Her hands, calloused and small, scattered grain for the clucking hens with a rhythm that seemed to lull them into a trance. She counted 12, the same as the morning prior, each one healthy and calm under her watchful eye. Next came the hogs. She dumped the kitchen slop into the trough, watching the sows jostle for position. Most people feared the great bristled boars, but Cora simply placed a palm on their rough hides, feeling the vibration of their grunts. "Easy, mothers," she would murmur, and the beasts would settle, their small, intelligent eyes blinking in recognition. She had always possessed this preternatural stillness with creatures. To her, they weren't just livestock, they were a community of silent witnesses. She understood the language of a flicked ear, the tension in a mule's neck, and the warning rattle of a snake. She listened when no one else did, and in return the animals of Blackwood Manor gave her their absolute trust. The mule in the far corner brayed, and Cora crossed the packed earth to refill his water bucket. As the cool water splashed, she felt a familiar ache in her chest. Usually, her 6-year-old brother Benji would be right at her heels, asking to pet the big, long ears or trying to catch the chickens. Benji was all gangly limbs and bright, infectious laughter, a spark of light in the dim reality of their lives. He loved the animals as much as she did, but he lacked her caution, often chasing the roosters until Cora had to scoop him up and scold him with a hidden smile. He had been missing since the dawn horn had blown. Cora had told herself he was merely on an errand for the mistress, perhaps fetching water or polishing silver in the big house. But as the shadows lengthened and the cicadas began their rhythmic droning song, a cold dread began to settle in her marrow. Benji was too small for the heavy work, yet the mistress was known for her sudden, sharp whims. Cora picked up the empty feed bucket and headed toward the kitchen house, the air so thick it felt like breathing through wet wool. She rounded the corner of the manor, planning to return the pail to its hook, when voices drifted through the open parlor window. Mistress Clara sat inside, her voice light and musical, as if she were discussing the weather rather than human lives. "The debts have become quite burdensome, Elias," she said to someone Cora couldn't see. "A woman of my standing cannot simply allow the neighbors to see the manor fall into disrepair. Appearances are the only currency we truly own." Cora froze against the weathered wood of the house, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Thorne's voice replied with a low, rough growl about the price of labor in the southern cotton belts. "The boy is young, barely 6. Clara continued, her tone dismissive. "But he is sturdy. The trader assured me he will bring a fine sum in the New Orleans market." He left with the wagon at first light. The bucket slipped from Cora's fingers, hitting the soft dirt with a muffled thud. She didn't stay to hear the rest. The world seemed to tilt and spin as she raced back toward the animal pens, her lungs burning with every jagged breath. Benji was gone, sold like a piece of furniture or a head of cattle to pay for silk ribbons and crystal decanters. The mistress hadn't even allowed their mother a final goodbye. A cold crystalline clarity settled over Cora as she reached the hog pen. If Benji could be vanished in the night, so could she. The threat of the auction block hung over every person in the quarters like a sharpened blade, and Cora realized then that she could no longer live under its shadow. She would not wait for the trader to return for her. The marsh, for all its terrors, offered a freedom the manor never would. She decided in that moment that she would vanish into the cypress reach before the moon was full, taking her chances with the dark water and the moss-draped trees. As dusk deepened into a bruised purple, Cora moved with mechanical precision to prepare for her flight. She stole into the kitchen when the cook was distracted, pocketing a heel of bread, a handful of dried apples, and a small wedge of salted pork. These she wrapped in a scrap of burlap and hid beneath her thin straw mattress. From under her pallet, she retrieved a small, crudely carved wooden bird, a gift Benji had whittled for her with a stolen knife. It was clumsy and lopsided, but to Cora it was the most precious thing in the world. She tucked it deep into her pocket, the wood pressing against her thigh as a silent promise. She looked at her mother, who was sleeping the heavy, dreamless sleep of the exhausted, and felt a pang of guilt that nearly broke her. But Cora knew that staying meant eventually being torn away anyway. At midnight, when the only sounds were the distant baying of a hound and the creak of the manor, Cora stepped out into the dark. She turned her back on the only home she had ever known, and began the long, silent walk toward the black waters of the reach. Cora stepped into the fringe of the cypress reach, where the solid earth surrendered to the hungry velvet mud. The marsh was a cathedral of rot draped in Spanish moss that hung like the tattered banners of a defeated army. Every step was a gamble. The water was as black as ink, hiding treacherous roots and the silent predators that lurked beneath the stagnant surface. Cora did not move with the panicked thrashing of a typical runaway. Instead, she moved like the animals she had spent her life tending, quiet, deliberate, and low to the ground. She remembered the time she had tracked a stray lamb into the outskirts of this very swamp. She had learned then that the marsh had a rhythm, a pulse that could be felt through the soles of bare feet. She navigated by the stars when the canopy allowed, and by the tilt of the ancient trees when the clouds moved in. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional splash of a slider turtle or the distant mournful cry of a barred owl. She was a ghost in a landscape of shadows, her heart beating a steady drum against the vastness of the wild. To anyone watching, she seemed less like a child in flight and more like a creature returning to its natural habitat, blending seamlessly into the dark, tangled vines. Back at Blackwood Manor, the dawn horn had not yet sounded when Elias Thorne made his morning rounds. He was a man of cold, predictable habits, and his first stop was always the quarters to count the heads of his labor. When he reached Cora's pallet and found only a cold, empty indentation in the straw, his face twisted into a mask of pure, vitriolic fury. He didn't just see a missing girl, he saw a defiance of his absolute control, a crack in the foundation of his authority. He marched to the main house, his heavy boots thundering on the porch, and woke the master with news of the theft. For in his eyes, Cora had stolen herself from the estate. The master, still in his silk nightshirt, didn't care for the girl, but he cared for the precedent of rebellion. "Take the pack, Thorne," he commanded, his voice thick with sleep and malice. "Bring her back as a warning to the others. I don't care what condition she's in, so long as she serves as a bloody example." Thorne smiled then, a jagged, terrifying expression that didn't reach his cold eyes. He lived for the hunt, and Cora would be the ultimate prey to break. The kennels erupted in a symphony of bloodlust as Thorne approached, 10 massive hounds, their coats a mix of brindle and charcoal, strained against their iron chains until the links groaned. These were not mere pets, they were instruments of terror, bred for endurance and trained to track a scent through the very gates of hell. Thorne selected Grim, the pack leader, first. The dog was a nightmare of muscle and bone, his eyes glowing with an intelligence that seemed almost human and twice as cruel. One by one, the other 9 were leashed, beasts with names like Malice, Cinder, and Fang. Thorne let them catch the scent from the burlap scrap Cora had left behind, and the morning air filled with their deep, vibrating bays. They surged forward, nearly pulling Thorne off his feet as they caught the trail leading straight into the heart of the reach. To Thorne, the girl was already as good as caught. No child could outrun 10 demons on a scent, especially not in the tangled, sucking mud of the cypress groves. He relished the thought of the pursuit, picturing the moment the pack would corner her in the mud. Cora heard them long before she saw them. The sound of the hounds was a rolling thunder that traveled across the surface of the water, bouncing off the trunks of the ancient trees until it seemed to come from every direction at once. Her blood turned to ice, but she did not freeze. She knew those voices intimately. She had been the one to pour their water and calm them when the summer storms rattled the wooden kennels. She knew that Grim led the charge with a deep, authoritative bark, and she knew that once they caught the scent of fear, there was usually no stopping them. She reached a narrow ridge of mud surrounded by deep black channels of standing water. Her breath came in shallow, jagged gasps, but she forced herself to stay still. Panicked running would only make the trail easier to follow and exhaust her lungs. She remembered how the hogs would stand their ground when a predator approached, and how the horses would huddle together to protect their own. She wasn't a hunter, but she was a part of the world they lived in, and she knew its secrets. She began to hum a low, vibrating note, the same sound she used to settle the dogs during the long, hot nights when they paced their pens in frustration. The hounds burst through a wall of sawgrass, their eyes wild and their tongues dripping with foam. Grim was in the lead, his powerful legs churning through the thick muck. Thorne was still several hundred yards back, shouting commands and blowing a brass whistle that pierced the humid air like a needle. As the pack reached the ridge, they skidded to a halt, surrounding Cora in a tightening circle of bared teeth and low, rumbling growls. Cora stood perfectly still, her small hands held open at her sides in a gesture of peace. She didn't look at their teeth. She looked directly into Grim's eyes, calling out to the memory of the scratches behind the ears and the stolen scraps of meat she had shared with him in secret. She spoke to them, not as a master, but as kin. "You know me," she whispered, the low hum vibrating in her chest. "We are all held by the same chain. Why would you tear your own?" The circle wavered. Grim's hackles lowered an inch, and the fierce barking softened into a confused, high-pitched whine as the dogs struggled between their brutal training and the deep instinctual bond they shared with the girl who had always shown them mercy. When Thorne finally broke through the brush, his rifle raised and his whistle shrieking for blood, he expected to find a girl torn to ribbons. Instead, he found a scene that would haunt his nightmares until his dying day. The 10 hounds were no longer attacking. They were circling each other in a frantic, silent dance of psychological confusion. As Thorne screamed for them to strike, the dogs seemed to snap under the pressure of his voice. It wasn't Cora they turned on, but the very training that had made them monsters. In a blur of fur and mud, the pack erupted into a self-destructive frenzy. They didn't bite Cora. They collided and fell, their spirits seemingly breaking under the weight of the girl's unnatural calm. 9 of the dogs slumped into the mud, not dead by violence, but seemingly drained of the will to breathe. Only Grim remained standing, his head bowed as if in deep shame. Cora was gone, vanished back into the mist of the deeper marsh, leaving Thorne alone in a graveyard of his own making. Cora and Grim pushed through the suffocating curtain of the inner reach, where the trees grew so dense they seemed to weave a ceiling of solid wood. The massive hound followed her with a limping gait, his fierce aggression replaced by a quiet, watchful reverence. He was no longer the instrument of Elias Thorne's malice. He was a companion bound by a silent covenant of survival. Every step Cora took was deliberate, her bare feet finding purchase on the gnarled knees of cypress trees that rose from the black water like the knuckles of a submerged giant. The humid air was a living thing, buzzing with the electric hum of dragonflies and the heavy scent of sweetwater rot. She was miles from the plantation now, far beyond the reaches where the search parties usually turned back in fear of the sucking mud. As the light began to fade into a sickly, jaded green, Cora spotted a peculiar formation of stones stacked near a willow oak. It was a marker subtle enough to be mistaken for a natural pile, but its geometry was too precise. She followed the direction of the top stone, and there, nestled into a hollow beneath the sprawling roots of an ancient cedar, she found the entrance to a structure that defied the chaos of the swamp. It was a hut, partially sunken and cloaked in a living skin of moss and ferns, so perfectly integrated into the earth that she would have walked past it a dozen times had she not been looking for the invisible. Inside the subterranean shelter, the air was surprisingly dry and smelled of old pine resin and dried herbs. Cora crawled into the dim space, Grim huddling at the entrance as a silent, woolly gatekeeper. The interior was a testament to the ingenuity of those who had lived in the shadows for generations. In one corner sat a collection of sharpened flint, stone mortars for grinding grain, and a bed of soft, dried reeds. But it was a small niche carved into the packed dirt wall that drew Cora's attention. Behind a flat slate stone lay a leather-bound bundle, its surface scarred by moisture but intact. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped it, revealing 3 journals filled with meticulous hand-drawn script. Cora had learned the basics of reading by squinting at the master's discarded newspapers. But these pages held a different kind of literacy. They were manuals of survival written in charcoal and berry ink by men and women who had turned the marsh into a fortress. The words were a lifeline. When the hounds are close, tread the stone creek to break the scent. And when the jay speaks of men, the crow speaks of storms. There were maps etched with charcoal showing the veins of the reach, hidden paths that bypassed the bogs and led toward the River of Stars, a rumored tributary that flowed toward the free territories. As the first stars began to prick through the canopy, Cora studied the journals with a hunger that surpassed her physical cravings. She learned the art of scent shuffling, realizing that her sweat was a map for the hunters that she could easily rewrite. Using a strip of her ragged dress soaked in the bitter juice of crushed wild garlic and swamp mud, she began to create a web of false trails. According to the journals, a hunter's dog follows the strongest path of fear, so she laid trails that doubled back on themselves and ended abruptly at deep water channels. She practiced the bird calls described in the second volume, a sharp rattling cry that mimicked the alarm of a blue jay. It was a language of the air that could warn her of a man's approach long before the sound of a snapped twig reached her ears. Grim watched her with a tilted head, his intelligent eyes tracking her every movement. He seemed to understand the shift in the power dynamic. She was no longer the prey, she was becoming a ghost of the cypress reach, a phantom that the marsh itself would protect. No longer just the girl who provided his meals, she was transforming into a master of the wilderness, an individual capable of commanding the very environment Thorne desperately sought to subjugate. Each piece of wisdom she internalized felt like a new layer of protective plating being hammered into place around her small, weary frame. These journals were more than just survival guides. They represented a collective memory of defiance. One entry from 5 years earlier detailed a woman who had sheltered in this exact cabin while her offspring were guided north by a traveler of the night. Cora's heart grew heavy as she absorbed the text, visualizing Benji on that transport, moving deeper into the somber core of Cotton Territory. The author had left clear directions on identifying the covert signals carved into the timber. A circle containing 3 lines indicated water, while a snapped limb pointing toward the sunrise marked the route to the river of stars. Cora understood in that moment that she was not solitary in her escape. She was a link in a long, translucent chain of people who had traversed these same muddy corridors. The terror that had been her constant shadow since the parlor window incident began to evolve into a frigid, silent resolve. She would not merely flee, she would become the myth the journals described, the one who could move through the world invisible and beyond reach. She practiced igniting a starfire, a small, fierce flame fueled by specific dry barks that emitted almost no smoke, using her own body to mask the light and keep the woods dark. Throughout the night, Cora polished her strategy. The writings cautioned that a tracker unable to catch his mark will eventually direct his fury inward, and she recognized in Thorn the ideal subject for such a mental siege. A man of iron is easily shattered by a phantom, the script implied. She began crafting tokens, small, carved shapes of bone and timber that she would deposit in locations where Thorn was certain to discover them. Using Benji's wooden bird as her guide, she carved haunting replicas resembling the animals she had once cared for at the manor. She intended to return to the edges of the plantation, not as a prisoner, but as a spectre that would plague Thorn's every waking second. By the time the dawn mist began to rise from the water, Cora felt an unfamiliar vigor in her body. She fed Grim the final portion of her salted meat, sharing the food as equals. The dog licked her palm, his coarse tongue a testament to the connection they now shared. She slid the journals back into her pocket, the leather resting against her hip like a concealed blade. The Reach was no longer a cage or a maze, it was her domain, and she was prepared to utilize its mysteries to dismantle the man who had stolen her brother's prospects. Miles away, the mood at Blackwood Manor was turning rancid. The tale of the 9 hounds had traveled through the quarters and into the surrounding lands like a fire in a dry shed. The overseers murmured about sorcery, while the laborers spoke of Cora as a ghost of the wetlands, a child who had called upon the swamp to devour those who followed her. Elias Thorne had become a pariah, his status as a legendary hunter demolished in a single evening of unexplainable defeat. He paced his small quarters, his eyes bloodshot and his hands shaking as he scoured his rifle for the 10th time. Every noise, the groan of a floorboard, the cry of an owl, made him flinch, his mind stuck on the loop of his prize pack, collapsing in the muck. The master had granted him 3 days to find the girl or face dismissal, a threat that meant total social collapse. Thorne had no inkling that the girl he hunted was no longer a terrified child crouching in the weeds. She was a pupil of the Maroons, equipped with the knowledge of decades and a dog that understood his every flaw. The nature of the hunt had shifted, and as Thorne stepped into the morning haze, he was oblivious to the fact that he was no longer the one holding the power. Cora moved through the changing patterns of the plantation's border like a gust of cold air, her presence felt but never witnessed. She spent the morning retracing the miles she had once covered in panic, but now her steps were guided by the cold logic of the hidden journals rather than the frantic pulse of a racing heart. She avoided the primary paths, choosing instead a low crawl through the thick honeysuckle and wild vines that rimmed the fields. From her hiding spot behind a lightning-scarred oak, she observed the distant workers moving through the cotton rows, their postures heavy and their spirits burdened by the same invisible weights she had finally cast off. She caught sight of Elias Thorne near the tobacco barn, his form a jagged silhouette against the fading afternoon light. He appeared different than he had just days before. His stance was no longer that of a certain predator, but of a man constantly checking his back. He gripped his rifle with white knuckles, his head jerking at every sudden movement of the breeze. Cora realized then that the legend of her supernatural abilities was causing more harm than any physical strike could. She recalled the journal's teaching, a man who dreads shadows will eventually find them everywhere. She settled into the roots of the oak with Grim resting his heavy jaw on her lap, and waited for the sun to drop below the horizon so she could commence the slow, rhythmic dismantling of the man who had extinguished her brother's joy. As the purple shades of twilight deepened into a moonless void, Cora began the opening phase of the siege. She employed the irregular sound patterns described in the second book of the secret journals. She collected a few bleached animal bones from the smokehouse pit, remnants of forgotten stock, and placed them in a deliberate spiraling design right outside Thorne's door. Nearby, she used a thin vine to tie a loose branch to a tree, setting it so the evening air would make it tap rhythmically against the cabin's wood, an erratic, mocking pulse. She then vanished into the darkness behind the hog barrels, waiting with the stillness of a predator. When Thorne finally came out to make his rounds, the flickering glow of his lantern illuminated the bone circle, and he jumped back as if he had encountered a snake. Cora watched him spin in a frantic circle, his light dancing wildly over the grass. From the shadows, she let out the low, vibrating bird call she had practiced, a sound that was neither human nor animal, but something that seemed to bleed out of the swamp itself. The noise bounced off the barn walls, appearing to come from every angle at once. Thorne's voice, once a loud roar of command, was now a thin, high rasp as he screamed for the girl to reveal herself to the night. By the next morning, the climate at Blackwood Manor had turned from strained to toxic. The workers huddled in quiet groups, their eyes shifting toward the overseer's house, where strange geometric patterns had been etched into the soft earth during the night. Cora had used a sharp branch to replicate the markings from the journals, circles with lines and crossing triangles that hinted at a lost language. To those who didn't know the secret, they appeared to be the seals of a vengeful ghost. When Thorne viewed them, he didn't even attempt to clear them away. He stood paralyzed, his face the shade of wet ash. The master, appearing on the porch in a state of high stress, demanded to know why the estate was in such turmoil. Thorne began to ramble, his arms moving wildly toward the forest, claiming the girl was sending birds to whisper his name and that the trees were closing in to trap him. Among the crowd were two nearby landowners, Mr. Dalton and Mr. Pierce, who had come to discuss the harvest. They watched Thorne's breakdown with obvious disgust and worry. The reputation of Blackwood was built on the facade of total rational control, and Thorne was currently breaking that facade in front of the county's most powerful men. The master's restraint finally broke. He no longer saw a loyal employee, but a liability whose instability was endangering the security of the entire plantation. The final removal of Elias Thorne was quick and cold. Under the judging eyes of the visiting gentry, the master commanded Thorne to gather his things and leave the property by dusk. A man who could be undone by the actions of a 10-year-old girl was no longer capable of wielding authority. Cora watched from the safety of the bushes as Thorne, the man who had once been the nightmare of her life, climbed onto his horse with a bag over his shoulder. He looked smaller, shrunk by his own dread. He rode toward the southern road, still yelling at the empty sky, his voice fading into a weak cry as the distance grew. The workers watched him leave in a silence so deep it felt like a collective breath finally being released. Cora felt no surge of victory. She had eliminated the immediate danger, but the framework that created him remained. She stayed out of sight as the plantation fell back into its routines under a new overseer, waiting for the signal mentioned in the maroon journals, a specific sequence of bird calls that would mark the arrival of a guide. She didn't have to wait long. As the heat of the day began to fade, a low, rhythmic whistle drifted from the western ridge. 3 short notes, a break, then 2 more. The signal for safe passage. Cora stepped out from her hiding place, grim, alert at her side. From the thick leaves emerged a man she recognized from the secret settlement, Jonas, the one who had charted the trading paths. He moved with a practiced, effortless quiet that made him nearly invisible even in the light. When he saw Cora, a look of massive relief washed over his face. "I have been following your marks for 2 days," he whispered, his eyes checking the area for any remaining threats. "You did more than just endure, child. You paved the way." He reached into his coat and produced a cloth bundle containing dried meat and a set of forged documents that identified Cora as a free child traveling with a protector. He explained that a path was opening, that very night, a series of stops that would lead her through the northern counties and eventually to the edge of the Free States. But more importantly, Jonas had information from the slave markets to the east. He had seen a list for a shipment headed toward a shipyard in the Chesapeake, and a boy matching Benji's description had been on it. The thread of hope, which had been a thin string, suddenly felt like a cord of iron. The midnight air at the meeting point was like a curtain of damp fabric, broken only by the pulsing of fireflies. Cora stood between two ancient oaks that Jonas had named the Gate of the Night, her fingers tight around a lantern. Beside her, Jonas checked his pocket watch, his face a collection of shadows in the dark. Following the rules from the journals, Cora waited for the specific quiet that came before a friendly arrival, the moment when the crickets stopped their noise in unison. The trip north was a difficult mosaic of hidden rooms and secret codes. They moved through the veins of the wilderness, using riverboats commanded by men like Samuel, who spoke only in the language of tides. Cora spent days in the cramped belly of a freight wagon, lying flat under a false floor while the scent of hay and dust filled her nose. Above her, the world went about its business, the sound of hooves, the cries of sellers, and the snap of whips that no longer controlled her. As they crossed the line into the rolling hills of the Northern Territories, the air itself seemed to lose its weight. The heavy humidity of the Cypress Reach was replaced by a sharp, cold wind that smelled of pine and snow. Clara and her brothers, Thomas and Peter, moved her like a rare cargo, passing her from one station to the next. In those moments, Cora understood that the invisible chain she had read about was real, a network of souls who decided that kindness was a more valuable currency than gold. By the time they arrived at the Avery farm, Cora's body felt like a vessel that had been drained and filled too many times. Ruth and Samuel Avery were people of quiet, hard-working compassion. Their home was a sanctuary of white paint and clean quilts. For the first time, Cora was given a room with a door that locked from the inside and a bed that didn't smell of desperation. The morning sun brought a wonder that even the journals hadn't predicted. Cora was sweeping the porch when she saw a familiar shape limping toward the gate. It was a massive, charcoal-colored dog, his fur full of burrs and his walk heavy with fatigue. Grim had found her. He had followed her through the swamps, the false paths, and the rivers, moved by a loyalty that went beyond the cruelty of his training. Cora dropped her broom and ran, the gate swinging open with a loud noise. I will use every secret the marsh gave me to bring him here. Through the network of guides, she began to track the Chesapeake shipyard shipments. She knew it would take time, but time was something she finally owned. The legend of the girl who broke the hounds lived on at Blackwood, a ghost story for overseers, but here she was, simply a sister waiting for her brother. As the first snow began to fall, Cora sat by the fire with Grim at her feet, a free woman beginning her greatest search of all.